Good morning. I'm Josh Lipsky, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's launch of the China Pathfinder Annual Scorecard, End of the Line, The Cost of Faltering Reforms. China Pathfinder is a 4-year project undertaken in partnership with Rhodium Group, and I'm very pleased today to be joined by Rhodium Group founding partner Dan Rosen, also Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council Geoeconomics Center, as well as a fantastic group of experts to unpack this new report. 4 years ago, the teams from Rhodium Group and the Atlantic Council set out to answer a complicated question. Can China's economic system be compared to the world's most open advanced economies? In the intervening time, the global economy navigated a pandemic, supply chain shocks, the highest inflation in 40 years, and the return of industrial policies across the G7. At the beginning of the project, policymakers and financial leaders in the West still viewed the Chinese economy with cautious optimism. Despite growing tensions between Beijing and Washington during the trade wars of 2017, China had made modest progress toward market economy norms since 2010. It was an open question whether China would continue that progress. 4 years later, we all know the answer. The Chinese economy has shifted away from market norms. But how the movement happened is just as important as the top line. The initial hope that China would adopt more transparent and market-oriented policies has failed to materialize. Instead, we see continued systemic state intervention and opaque decision-making. The lack of clarity around China's decision-making is now seen as a source of global economic risk. The Chinese Communist Party's growing role in the economy stifles the private sector's dynamism and fosters a dangerous environment of uncertainty for investors. The decline of the property sector and the correlated focus on manufacturing have raised alarm bells worldwide about the possibility of a second China trade shock. China's prioritization of national security over economic growth has frozen most reform efforts, and we will show it in the data. That is the value of a data-driven approach to China's economy. Instead of trying to calibrate policy based on official statements or one-off events, our method was to be comprehensive, objective, and focused on long-term trends. Right now, all eyes are on the US election. The next administration will develop a range of policies to grapple with China on trade, technology, Taiwan, and more. What kind of economic system will they be dealing with? As you will see today, China Pathfinder helps tell that story. What has surprised us the most in this process is how universally translatable this story is. These reports have been used by economists from West Point to Warsaw. Whether in London, Paris, Tokyo, or Beijing, you can find China Pathfinder referenced and cited. And so the answer to the question we set out to explore 4 years ago is clear. Is it possible to compare China's system to the world's open advanced economies? Yes, and it's important work. So let's get to the data. Dan, welcome back. It's year 4 of China Pathfinder, the end of this generation of the China Pathfinder process. Before we dive into the new data and the report, I wanted you to help set the scene for us a little bit of how we got here in this research.
Josh, it's so good to be back here for another annual report release with you. Thinking back to the beginning, China has been, continues to be, the biggest variable in the geoeconomic equation. A lot of economies out there that make up global market share, relatively predictable. In the OECD economies, that's generally the case. China is the biggest unknown. And whether it is the world's biggest contributor to global growth and opportunity, or comes up short, is in turn dependent on the quality, character, and pace of policy change in an economy that's only partly marketized, only partly through the process of becoming an advanced, more modern economy. And that's what we set out to offer a more objective way to grapple with that question.
So let's get into the new data, and this is all available now, chinapathfinder.org, also on the Atlantic Council website. You can find the new report. I want to start by explaining to people the 6 metrics by which we evaluate open market economy norms.
You know, you could approach the question of is a country market-oriented by looking at hundreds and hundreds of different variables to try to do that. That's more than any policymakers or general public can possibly digest. And so we boil it down to 6 core elements that we can use to talk about the differences between a market-oriented system and a non-market-oriented system. 3 of those are inherently to do with China's domestic economic setting. the finance system, the degree of market competition, and the way the innovation system works. And the other three are more on the external side: trade openness, foreign direct investment openness, and portfolio openness. So that's how we set it up. That's the framework we decided to use. In each case, looking at a reasonable way to describe what it means to be market-oriented in different ways across the top 10 OECD advanced market democracies, and then China by comparison, using the same scoring rubric that we use for the OECD economies. And so that's what you've got in this signature graphic that we've used throughout the project to look at where China stands here in red versus the open economy average in the yellow line.
And you can also see where China was in 2010 to benchmark progress.
Yeah, we need to come back and talk about that a little bit because there's a crucial story about what's happening and not happening here today, but it's also important to take the larger picture to mind and consider what's possible, not just in years, but in terms of decades of policymaking.
So let's start with financial system development here, because the score shifted a little in the positive direction for China, but I think your guidance is don't overinterpret that.
So right. So Pathfinder allows us to look at year-on-year change by clicking through each of the years we've done this together, as Josh is showing you there. You can see the changes year-on-year back to 2020 when we got started in this partnership. And then, as Josh mentioned, we've got the 2010 benchmark there as well. But if we look at the financial system as it showed up in the latest annual data through the end of 2023, on the face of it, we've got a slight technical improvement of China's score. Coming off the COVID years, not surprisingly, the financial system was able to get a little bit more back to work, reopening for a few IPOs and things like this. And so China's score on that dimension in the latest edition moves a little bit to the right, which means in a more market-oriented direction. But we also, in the report, include a contextual discussion of what everybody knows to be the case, that despite the fact they were able to get their numbers to move a little bit in a market direction, the larger story in financing is that this is an economy more and more at risk of a general financial, sort of malaise, I would say, to avoid using the C word of crisis. But all is definitely not well in the Chinese financial system.
And I think it's just worth pointing out, and we'll see if I can pull this up here, if we look at some of the countries here, Italy, I think this is Spain, people might be interested to see countries that are to the left of China.
So, and this is why we chose to use the whole array of 10 largest OECD economies to make the point that there's not just one answer to what a market orientation looks like in each of these dimensions. Big difference between Rome and London and Washington in terms of what it means to do your best to have a financially dynamic market environment. And indeed, China has moved ahead of the OECD laggards, in this case showing up to be so in Spain and Italy. But consider that China, as a $17 trillion economy, inherently has much more room for financial depth and breadth. Means it's a large capital market. It should be enough to attract global interest and have all the different varieties of financial sector players, from banks to non-banks, insurance, and all sorts of alternatives as well. So we shouldn't at all be surprised to see that China is able to compete with, sort of the low end of what it means to be OECD-like in terms of having financial players. The question is, why have they not made more progress given the scale of the Chinese economy?
And useful as a frame of reference is to see the US, unsurprisingly, at the far end of financial system
Sets the standard for global financial openness, no question about it there. While the US has kind of pulled back from a purely liberal model in trade, we might talk about a little bit here today. In finance, you really can't find a large major economy that is nearly as dynamic as the United States is in finance.
So let's get to market competition. I know this is one you always like to focus on when we do this presentation.
Yeah, if you could only have one of these six to address the question of, is China still making a headway toward being more market-oriented, you'd probably want to use market competition. We're looking here at a whole variety of different indicators that you'll find detailed in the report, such as how big a role do state-owned enterprises play in the economy? And we can pretty much start and stop there, because whereas right through 2016, 2017, Beijing was really making serious effort to make room for independent boards of directors, running corporate governance at private firms, which were supposed to be where the action was in China's future. Since around that time, and we very much see it in the Pathfinder indicators here, state-owned enterprises have been pushed back to the front and are taking up more and more of the oxygen in the room. I think if we look, for example, as you'll find in the report, at how big a role SOEs have in bond issuance in China, just shy of 95% of
great
all
data and
activity
charts on this
in
in
the
the
bond
report.
industry is state enterprises. And so you're just not going to have market competition dynamism, anything like what you see across the OECD in a country that has that big a role for state enterprises.
So let's go to modern innovation system. China scores better here. They have historically in our research over 4 years. The US actually a little worse than some of the other metrics.
Yeah, in innovation, I mean, a sort of large sample of folks who pay attention to the global economy would generally assume that China is actually doing great on this dimension. And indeed, when we look at its position relative to the OECD averages, they're pretty close there and have made considerable movement toward market orientation. What does that mean? It means that more private-oriented venture capitalists play a big role in deciding where the cutting edge is going to be and funding new innovation, research, and development in an economy, for instance. And also that you have the institutions necessary to protect intellectual property so that if you take some risk trying to innovate and develop something, you're going to be able to enjoy the benefits of having taken that risk rather than having government come over and force the purchase of a big share of your business at the last minute after you succeed. And while China's done great traditionally over the past decade here, it's really stuck in neutral now. And I mentioned venture capital a second ago. While the numbers suggest that venture capitalists should still be interested in being in China, Chinese venture capitalists themselves are essentially saying, we're out, we're done, we can't work in this environment any longer. So pretty radical changes taking place in financing within innovation in China.
So those are the domestic metrics. Let's look at the external ones. Trade openness. This surprised me because China has done better historically in our research on this, but not so this year. And you can compare, we can go back to 2022 here and see the shift where this is China in 22, and now let's go China in 23, if I can pull it up, and some backsliding.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. And also, just a side point here, we're talking about 3 on the domestic side, 3 on the external. There are so many other things that we're not putting in the framework for the sake of concision, simplifying things to the point where people can digest. Of course, there's a lot more to talk about than just these elements, but these are this is a really important way to kind of get the cliff notes, if you will. On trade, look, China today is seeing its goods exports go through the ceiling, right?
Well noted in
and
Europe.
Is that good news? Yeah. Well, I mean, in a sense, it means China's a bigger part of global trade. However, the character and nature of that trade surplus that China has built up is such that it has overturned the apple cart, if you will, and set off alarm bells, not just in Washington, certainly in Brussels, as we know from the past month, with duties being applied to Chinese exported electric vehicles for the first time. Something's happened here that is changing how we think about China's trade, goods trade, export success, right? So still got a strong position on the chart here, but how we interpret the strength we see changing rapidly in terms of goods trade. The reason why this score has actually backslid a little bit, as you note, is that it's not all about goods trade. In fact, the more you get to be an advanced high-income economy, the more services trade matters. Yeah. And at the cutting edge, as the Geoeconomic Center is quite focused on, digital trade as well. This is where so much of the marginal growth and what it means to be a trading economy are. And on those dimensions, China is not moving whatsoever. They're not keeping pace with what it means to open up in those dimensions of trade.
And I'll show folks here, each of these metrics, you can dive deeper into it and understand, Dan is saying here, there's the goods trade, But here we go services trade, here we go tariff rates, and you can compare here. This is how we get to the composite scores up top. So there's a lot of data to go through in each of these. I'm just showing the trade one here to give folks a flavor of what they can explore on the Pathfinder website.
Dizzying amount of complexity underneath each of these high-level distillations that we're offering you. Some people will be well-served just to kind of stay at the high level, and others are going to want to dig in and see what details available behind each of these 6 areas.
So final 2, this is traditionally where China has scored the weakest in our metrics, direct investment openness, portfolio investment.
Yeah, China, less developed countries in general are well advised not to simply fling their doors open to the vagaries of global capital flows. However, when it comes to direct investment, which means companies bringing capital in to do fixed investment, build factories, build buildings, build offices, plant and equipment, China has generally been a star in that dimension for decades and decades. We'll get to portfolio flows in a second, but even on the direct investment story that China is such a poster child for how to do it better, 2023, which started with great enthusiasm among multinational investors that now that the pandemic's done, hopefully we're going to have morning in Beijing and we're going to have a really great opportunity to build our businesses out. By the end of 2023, completely different conversation involved. And now we look at the most recent data that we're now picking up into 2024. And in the second quarter of this year, Josh, we have a net deficit in FDI for China of $88 billion.
That's just the last quarterly data.
Last quarterly data we have versus what was previously typical a decade ago of $100, $200 billion a year of net inflow of FDI to China. So this is a brave new world, even in the direct investment channel that China had previously had so much promise in.
And finally, portfolio investment.
Finally, portfolio. No one expects a $5,000 or even a $10,000 economy to be as open to global capital flows as the United States is, or Britain, or what have you. However, China is not just the typical developing country, is it? No one more than Beijing has trumpeted the potential for increasing global capital flows in and out of China. Global indexers like MSCI and FT all counseled 4 years ago to up your allocation to China because that's where the marginal growth is going to be. Instead, when we look at the degree of portfolio investment openness, and we're talking stocks and bonds here, not building whole factories, so it shouldn't be that hard for money to cross the border. Certainly, Beijing would love to see more foreign investment flowing into the A-share market, not just for short-term speculative opportunities. We'll probably talk about current conditions here after today's 7% fall in China's markets after the announcement of stimulus measures. But as you can see, this is the biggest single gap between China and what it means to be an advanced economy. And China hasn't moved very much at all. Even since 2010 in the benchmark there, very little movement relative to these other dimensions. So that tells us a lot about how ready China is to be like more advanced OECD economies. And when we look at the reasons why Beijing is nervous about opening for portfolio flows right now, we look at the risks inside the Chinese financial system, it's not surprising at all. There's no reason to expect that that can be remedied, I would say, anytime soon.
So that's the data, and the data, of course, is backwards looking, and in our panel in a moment, we're going to go more forward looking of what this means for China, for the US, for economies around the world. 2 final questions for you, Dan. There's one way to think about this study over 4 years and say, well, this is a COVID story. Really, so much of what's happened in China has to do with COVID and the impacts of the pandemic. What would you say?
I would say this is not a COVID picture we're getting here at all, nor is it about weakness in economies abroad that's causing Chinese factories to run a little bit slower, nor is it about geopolitics even. Almost every structural concern that we're talking about up here, you and me together, and you'll find greatly detailed in the report, predates the pandemic. The seeds of these problems, the problems in Chinese financial intermediation, the delay in implementing the make the market decisive plans that Xi Jinping came in with in 2013, all of those things are pre-2020 phenomena. They're problems that weren't solved then when they needed to be, and they still haven't been solved today. Until they are solved, China's going to continue to grapple with these kinds of headwinds.
The final thing I'll ask you, looking at this, the 2010 to today benchmark, you could say, well, of course this was where it's going to end up. But we've talked about this a lot over the research over the last 4.5 years now. This story was not inevitable.
No, it didn't have to be this way. And that's why we include the 2010 benchmark, as well as talk about this year over last year, those years after versus 2020, right? We can see that from where China started this journey 15 years ago, it was, for half that period, the first half, able to make really dramatic progress toward marketizing, toward putting independent boards in, toward opening up for outbound capital flows out of China, and also laying the groundwork to have capital come in. There was a lot of work done a decade ago to try to make the domestic capital markets play a larger role that didn't constantly require government stepping in and signaling, like we got yesterday and we'll get again this Saturday, like what the government wants to happen, which is no way to run a modern economy. So we know that China can make progress when it puts its mind to it. It has really redefined what's possible over our entire professional lifetimes, hasn't it? We also know just as clearly that in the present period, they're not doing the hard, necessary work to take the next lap around the track.
Dan, thank you. Thanks to our colleagues at Rhodium Group and across the Geoeconomic Center and the Atlantic Council who have worked on this over 4 years. We're going to join our fantastic panel here and unpack the data and go forward looking into what this means for the Chinese economy. Please. So, joining us to unpack everything we just presented in that whirlwind 15 minutes, I am honored to have Michelle Caruso-Cabrera, CEO, MCC Global Enterprises, CNBC contributor, Melanie Hart, Senior Director of the Global China Hub. Welcome to the Atlantic Council, Melanie, just joining us from the State Department, and Clete Willems, former Deputy Assistant to the President for International Economics, Deputy Director of the NEC at the White House in the Trump administration, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council Geoeconomic Center, and partner at Aiken Gump. Thank you all for being here. Michelle, I want to start with you. Dan alluded to what's happened over the past week in terms of announcements from the PBOC, from fiscal authorities in China. How do you assess the market reaction, which has been pretty volatile, and is it enough in the Chinese economy to balance some of the risks that we've outlined here?
So first, thanks for inviting me, and thanks also, Dan, to you and the Atlantic Council for putting a lot of data in black and white with hard edges around it that we all kind of knew intuitively based on what we had seen anecdotally through the last 10 years or so, but to see it really solidified in a way that is very, very helpful. What they've announced recently, is it enough? No, despite the ferocious rally and now subsequent decline that we've seen. And I think Dan really nails it with the continued state intervention into the economy. You can say, okay, we're going to lower the reserve ratio, we're going to make capital more abundant and cheaper. But if the people deploying it or the institutions deploying it aren't very good at deploying it, like state-owned enterprises, which have terrible returns on equity and assets, it's not going to be very effective. I would also say, I spoke with one of the CEOs who met with the leadership back in March. Photo plastered on every single newspaper around the world. Those CEOs who went to see Xi Jinping, and I asked him. I said, "Did you get any indication that they were going to lower the role of the state in the economy?" He said, "No, just the opposite. That's not going to change." And all of those CEOs had spent a lot of decades investing in China, and so they had many friends there. And he said, "My friends there are demoralized, reticent to deploy capital, a little bit frightened. So when your best and your brightest don't want to deploy the capital, it's not going to be very effective." The rally, you can see very ferocious rallies in emerging markets. Yes. We saw it in emerging market debt markets. That's why traders like to trade the emerging markets, right? Yeah. It's a lot easier to make money on a big gap than scraping nickels in the treasury market.
Right.
So to see this decline today doesn't surprise me either.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I guess there'll be more announcements we expect over the next 48 hours.
They've announced another meeting on Saturday
We'll stay tuned to it.
Calm everybody down, I'm sure.
Melanie, I want to turn to you. You've just come from state where you were leading so much of these efforts on China coordination, on economic policy. From a U.S. policymaker's perspective, when you see the state of the Chinese economy as we've outlined it here, what does that mean for your approach, how you engage? Are there opportunities there? Are there risks? How do you take the picture seen here and apply it from a U.S. government perspective?
Sure, thank you. Glad to be here and glad to be joining the Atlantic Council. The number one word at the forefront of not only U.S. policymakers, but policymakers in ally and partner countries is de-risking. Yeah. There's a lot of unpredictability and risk that shines throughout your report. One element of it is the fact that clearly Xi Jinping has made the decision so far to not do the hard work required to grow China in a sustainable market economy way, but rather to double down on subsidizing exports and dump them on global markets, which threaten our automakers and Europe's automakers. That's a risk for us to think about. We also have the risk whereby China acts as a unified buyer and seller in global markets. And from an economic coercion perspective, many nations have faced the challenge of they've been selling to China, but that suddenly gets cut off if they do something that Beijing decides they don't like. There's another risk that we all have to think about of, first of all, the fact that the Chinese economy is as big as it is, and they are being blatantly, flagrantly non-transparent about what's happening within that economy brings another layer of risk. And I thought that the report handled really well the gradual and increasing disappearance of information that you had been relying on to make assessments of the Chinese economy. We shouldn't sugarcoat that. Yeah. That's a really big deal. If the second biggest economy in the world doesn't want people to know what's really happening inside of it, what the actual growth rates are, what youth unemployment is, that presents another element of risk. And then one thing we have to remember too is for developing nations that have been depending on PRC investment into hospitals, into roads, some of the numbers indicate that that investment is starting to dry up, and that creates another risk that we have to think about in the developing world. We don't want a Lehman Brothers style crisis of developing country infrastructure finance. From a US perspective, all of those things are active concerns that are on the table. I wish that I could say that I see great opportunity to engage Beijing and the problems be fixed overnight and have China go a different direction. We have to be real. That's not the signal that we're picking up from Xi Jinping. So most of where I see the answers are working with allies and partners to de-risk collectively so that we can reduce each of our costs.
I'm really glad you raised the data point. China is a member, of course, of the IMF. They have a responsibility under the Articles of Agreement to provide data transparently. We've talked a lot about in our research together, Dan, with Rhodium Group, about how that's not happening. So this is something we'll continue to focus on, but I think you're right to raise it. Clete, Melanie talked about manufacturing capacity. We talked about EVs in the presentation with Dan. Can you outline your thinking on what it means when we say China's overcapacity in manufacturing? Treasury's Jay Shambaugh spoke about this recently. The IMF had a different view. I'm curious for your perspective.
Yeah, so first of all, great report, and thanks for having me. And I suspect we'd probably agree quite a bit on a lot of these issues. I think most folks who have worked on China issues in a Republican or Democratic administration see a lot of the problem the same way. And I think it's scary right now looking at the future, whether it's in EVs or in these other areas. And I think what we see going on is that China is basically doubling down, as she put it, in terms of investing in certain sectors. I think part of it is as a jobs program. I think part of it is to distort global markets. And because their economy isn't doing so well at home, we expect a lot more of that excess capacity to be exported abroad. And I think the next couple of years are scary for EVs and for a whole range of other products. The other thing we see going on in the EV space is not only is China producing a lot at home that it's going to export, but it's also targeting third countries and then trying to use those as bases to sell into the United States. They're looking at some of our FTA partners like Mexico and Morocco. So I think, I don't know if I need to take a side in the discussion of exactly how you define excess capacity, but it's producing beyond what an economic rationale would suggest in normal market economy situation, and it's being done for these variety of reasons.
And then if you were back in the White House now and you were there, in 2017, 2018, then what would you advise from a policy stance to address the second China trade shock, however materialized?
So look, this is another area where I think there's a lot of overlap between Republican and Democrat, but maybe some important distinctions. One point I do want to make where I think we would agree is that no one is naive enough to think, okay, China's going to become a market economy and we have the ability to totally change their economic model. It's pretty clear which direction they're going to go under Xi Jinping. We're not naive. So I do think this notion of working with others to shape the environment around them, to figure out how do we trade freely amongst ourselves, how do we cabin in their excess capacity, that is the way to go. That is the direction I would advise President Trump to take. But I want to actually, from a broader perspective, highlight, I think, the similarities in architecture, and which is, the Biden administration talks about investing in the United States. I think that's something a Republican administration would want to do. Now, they might do it slightly differently, and the way they would look at doing this is through tax cuts and regulations and things that make it easier for the private sector to invest in the United States, but the concept's the same. And then there's this question of competing with China, and I think our tariff structures have been pretty similar. I suspect that will be the case going forward. And then on this question of aligning with others, I think the Biden administration has tried to do this through IPEF, through the global arrangement on steel and aluminum. I suspect the Trump administration would be interested in doing this too, but maybe with more robust trade tools where you're actually aligning tariff structures and things like that. So a lot of similarities. And then lastly, in the engagement with China, again, this goes to my point about not trying to change China's market orientation. I do think that, like the Biden administration, a Trump administration would and should engage with China. But I suspect under a Trump administration, there'd be more of an interest in revisiting some of the things we had in the Phase 1 deal and actually trying to figure out in these sectors that aren't EVs, that are more commoditized, that there is an international security threat. Can we actually sell more in America? Can our company, or in China, can our companies actually sell more in China? So again, I wanted to point that out because I think there's a ton of overlap, strategic overlap, and maybe some differences in tactics within those silos.
I'm definitely going to come back to the Phase 1 deal at some point. We'll talk about that. But Dan, let me bring you in on the overcapacity issue.
Yeah, I have something to add to it that I think is crucial and helps bring all sides of the House together here around what ought to be a really crucial action item, finding the maximum amount of alignment with friends and allies and like-minded countries that are similarly concerned about the damage to basic market dynamism if one of the biggest players in the game is not using the same rules and norms and incentives to organize its economic activity. And that is this, that big part of the overcapacity problem, of course, is that Beijing is pouring more and more resources on top of what's already an overcapacity set of industries and sectors. But the other side of the China problem here is the part that Beijing didn't even expect, which is that its demand side was going to fall through the floor. Beijing did not plan for this much malaise in the household sector. So yes, there's an oversupply, but there's an under-demand much worse than anybody in Beijing imagined. And we see them flailing to try to figure out how to stimulate it back to life. They don't know. And so even if we wanted to negotiate with them, even if our German friends wanted to try to cut a deal, even if we went back to doing Phase 1 first of like a trade deal and doing the structural later, there's only so much Beijing can promise to do because they don't even understand the shock to their own demand problems right now. So we kind of have to do Phase 2, if we want to call it that, first, and acknowledge the structural problem in the Chinese system and the limits of what they can really credibly put on the table to help deal with this. What does that mean? That means that this is a one-sided negotiation among market democracies more than a two-sided negotiation with friends in Beijing about what they're going to do about it, because there's really not that much at this point other than take 5, 7, 8 years aside to fix the problems that they've let fester in their own system.
Well, Michelle, let me pick up on that because if we're talking about Beijing's perspective on this, and I take what Dan's saying, if there's only so much Beijing can do given the constraints and the lack of demand. But when we think about Xi Jinping and how he prioritizes national security over economics, we often frame it that way. The party prioritizes security concerns over economic concerns. But I wonder if it's that clear a story. We saw during zero COVID, the U-turn in policy that then reversed some of that. Now you see some of the stimulus measures. How do you see the decision-making internally?
Yeah, so obviously the decisions get made at very, very high levels, and the process for deciding them are uncertain, which leads to uncertainty. The way I think about this is, I had a foray into politics, and what I learned viscerally, and that I think we all know intuitively, is that people in power want to stay in power. It doesn't matter how they got the power. If they were democratically elected, it was a backroom deal, maybe they had a coup, whatever. Once they're there, they want to stay in power. And so every decision they make, you should see it as they think that doing this will help them stay in power. So what I think part of the rally was that we saw over the, when the announcements first started coming in was, aha, the leadership thinks they need to improve the economy to stay in power. It was a signal to a lot of participants like, oh, we're finally going to get something here, right? Because those decisions, when you have an independent central bank, they just chug along and make the decisions when they want to do, and it becomes very predictable, and you have 10,000 people on CNBC who tell you what they think they're going to do because they all understand the framework, right? When you don't have an independent central bank, you kind of wait around and see and say, oh, okay, now it's coming. So I think that is part and parcel of why we saw this huge gyration in the markets there. But, still going back to the original problem that I pointed out, if you have too much state intervention at every single level with the Communist Chinese Party being everywhere and a part of so many decisions, you're actually not going to get the returns that you expected from those moves.
So the U-turns come, but they can flip back around.
Absolutely, just like we saw with during COVID. Exactly. Clearly, there was a concern that, if we keep doing what we're doing, maybe we'll not be in power anymore. So
that's
they undid it. Yes.
I think that's really helpful as the driving principle, and then you can see the decision-making with that framework. Melanie, let me turn to you on the technological front. We show in the scores here that innovation system, unsurprisingly, as Dan said, does relatively well in China, given a lot of the advances coming out across a range of technologies. The Biden administration is aware of that. You see the decisions that have been made, and you've been part of them over the past several years. We think of export controls. We think of everything that's been done. How do you see those decisions going forward? Do you think they're effective? And how do you assess them internally in terms of what the next step should be?
Sure. So first, I think it's really important that we separate out industrial policy from national security policy, because the administration sees those as very different things, and they should be. So on the industrial policy side, markets prioritize profit and efficiency, and that doesn't always check the box for governments who, in the semiconductor sector, for example, profit and efficiency might mean that we have no fabs in the United States, and there's been a decision made that for the sake of supply chain reliance and national security, we want to have some manufacturing here. So industrial policy is used to turn that on, to provide business incentives so that companies can make a profit with more than market incentives needed to make a profit, building fabs in the United States. That's the industrial policy side. The US does that very differently from China. I noticed the report kind of measured OECD and China industrial policy similarly, but it's important to realize that US semiconductor industrial policy is giving subsidies to TSMC and Samsung.
Yeah,
so it is there, right? So open to the best and the brightest globally. Yeah. It's not about US firms beating firms from other countries. China is not giving massive, subsidies on equal footing to US companies. Yeah. Japan is, which is great. So there are two different ways of doing industrial policy. What you raised is national security policy. And again, from an economic standpoint, you could look at China as just a market, but they're more than just a market. Governments have to take the national security side into consideration as well. China just fired an ICBM in our general direction, right? Beijing is ramping up their nuclear arsenal at a pace that we have never seen in history and refusing to tell anyone what those nukes are for. The Atlantic Council just last week released a great report demonstrating and making the case that there is a real risk that China would use nukes against the United States in a Taiwan Straits crisis. So from a Washington standpoint, we can't just think about market efficiency. We also have to think about where are these tech components going. And so I think that the Commerce Department, the Biden administration has done a very good job at working to target specifically what are the tech components that would fuel China's military machine and make it easier to fire an ICBM at the United States or otherwise target the US and our allies. Those very specific components are blocked from selling to China. It is incredibly hard to figure out what is the exact range of tech that I need to block to avoid from fueling China's military machine, but not undermine market sales unnecessarily. And that is why you see the administration re-upping these on a routine basis. They do their very best, watch what happens, see how technology develops over time, because the tech innovation cycle is always moving, and update as needed. And I expect that whoever wins in November, that continual assessment and update process will continue. That's the only way to get it right when tech is moving and changing as fast as it is.
That makes complete sense. And Secretary Raimondo was here, right here, a few months ago, and she talked about Chinese EVs and sensors. And so she made the national security argument, not the industrial policy argument, when it comes to EV policy. I just wonder, and Clete, maybe I'll turn to you on this, does China see the distinction as clearly as we see the distinction on the national security and industrial policy? Because I'm not sure they operate that way domestically.
Yeah, look, I give the Biden administration a lot of credit for trying to hold the line there and trying to explain both to China and to our partners and allies and also to our own companies sort of how they're drawing the distinctions. And I think sometimes you can do that. But I think it is tough to hold the line, and here's why. I do think inherently that the saying that we had in the Trump administration that there is a clear link between economic security and national security is unambiguously true. Yeah. If you have the strongest economy with the most innovative companies, the most money to spend, you know what? You're probably going to have the strongest military too, and you're probably going to have a lot of tools at your disposal, whether they're sanctions or other things, to be able to achieve your national security goals. I mean, if the dollar wasn't the world's leading currency, I mean, would we be able to use sanctions the way that we are? Probably not. And so I think it's impossible to fully deny that linkage. That said, I do think that in implementing things like export controls, trying to maintain sort of the small yard, high fence, these are the things that really go into the ICBM. I do think that's important for credibility. It's important to try to bring the allies along. But I think it's a difficult distinction to make in every case.
And let me just come back on the phase one, the trade deal for a second. How would things be different this time around, right? So Dan talked about weak demand internally in China, but imagine you were entering that negotiation. What's different when you have the parameters that she's dealing with compared to 2018?
Right. Well, look, I mean, I do think China's economy is in a weaker position today than it was then, and I think we could use that to our advantage. I also think we probably have a clearer perception of what are the go, no-go zones within China. I think we probably have a clearer perception of what we can and cannot get them to do. And one of the things I mentioned earlier is sort of the concept of, we're going to make them more market-oriented like us. I think we're past that, right? And I think in 2017, we were just sort of starting to explore that space. So I do think it's different. But when I talk about revisiting phase one, let me be a little bit more clear about what I mean. I mean, I think the first thing is that if there is a Trump administration, they would want to come in and say, can we just first check whether this deal that we got in 2020 has the potential to make some meaningful changes for our economy and our businesses? And I think it's really unfortunate. President Trump and Xi signed this thing, literally a couple weeks before the world shut down. So COVID got in the way. And then with all due respect to the Biden administration, once they came in, they kind of let the deal rot on the shelf. They didn't pursue it. They didn't try to enforce it. And so I think step one for a Trump administration would be, let's enforce this thing, see if we can harvest some of the value we got the first time around, and then see how China responds. Do they fix those problems? Yes or no? Do they come to the table in a meaningful way? Yes or no? And only then, if it does seem that they're serious and it does seem that they're willing to do things, would you sort of go beyond that? So I think it's kind of an incremental approach where we'd come in, we'd try to enforce the deal, and then we'd see what happens.
I'm going to let Melanie just respond quickly to that, and then Michelle, I'm coming to you next.
So I'm going to take issue with the Biden administration didn't come in and try to enforce. Ambassador Tai has been very public on the fact that she made a very good faith effort to get China to deliver on the promises that they didn't deliver to the Trump team, and they didn't deliver to the Biden team. And I think we'd be a little naive to think maybe the third time's the charm.
On that note, Michelle, I'm going to turn to you.
Yeah.
We've been talking a lot of this bilaterally, U.S.-China, touched on Europe a little bit, on EVs. But what about the emerging markets around the world? I mean, so much of what we've outlined here has enormous ripple effects there, even more so than it does directly on the U.S.
Yeah, China's growth through the decades obviously was going to be a driver of global growth, and we all anticipated a certain pace of it, which would, of course, would lead to more desire for commodities throughout different parts of the world. Latin America, I can think of, I spent a lot of time covering Latin America. China is the largest trading partner for South America, second largest for Latin America, because when you include Mexico and the U.S. are biggest trading partners. And China's interests are twofold. One is food security. They're interested in soybeans, interested in coffee, and all those. Also mineral security. And also ideologically, they want to align with places like Cuba, Venezuela, bring other folks along if they can, using their economic power as a cudgel and coercion. I just interviewed the president of Guatemala at the Council on Foreign Relations when he was in town for the UN. You can see this on their website. And they sent a delegation to Taiwan for the president's inauguration. And all their coffee was stopped on a ship and can't go into port now. And they're still trying to work that out. They're increasing, their lack of anticipated growth will lead to less money, which is less stuff they can buy, could lead to more desires for greater coercion as well. Their levels of direct investment in Latin America, substantial to Latin America, not so substantial to the Chinese. So I don't know how much it would falter or fall. And then, of course, they want to be ideologically, they want to help out those people who support them ideologically, right? That's why we see them, if and when Venezuela, someday it will be restructured, because it needs to be, China's going to have to be at that table because it's such a big lender to Venezuela.
It can't be done without China at the table. No, it's hard to imagine.
Yeah.
Dan, I want to pick up on something Melanie said about industrial policy. You and I have had this debate in the China Pathfinder project, and Melanie correctly points out U.S. versions of industrial policy are very different than Chinese versions of industrial policy. Brad Setzer has this great line that I think about, and he was here last year when we launched the third edition of Pathfinder. If you don't have an industrial policy, you're importing China's industrial policy, which I think, and we outlined some of the elements of China's industrial policy here. Do you agree with that assessment? And how do you assess the last 4 years of administration policy?
I think it's true, essentially, right? And back in the day when industrial policy was not such a hot button topic as it has become, it was an exception to market norms that was applied to a relatively modest amount of economic activity, right, in large economies, say in the United States, right, where we always had a little bit cooking where certain known criteria were met. There was a market failure. There was some barrier to entry that would prevent a really positive, beneficial evolution in technology from taking place that needed some government nudging, right? And those have been well understood and well researched. And just roughly speaking, I would say like maybe 2, 3, 4, 5% of the U.S. economy in that golden age of market, norms was addressed with some sort of industrial policy framework. When you look at the scope of China's Made in China 2025 program, just to name one major plank in their industrial policy array, and look at how much of the economy is covered by some sort of state intention overwhelming any sense of private market, drivers at work, it's about maybe 50% or more of the economy must be understood as the result of state intention in politics rather than market forces and demand and supply activity. And so that is spilling over into the world economy. China is setting prices in all of these industries where it has decided to drive using industrial policy at home. And if they could continue to deliver the prices we see today in electric vehicles and solar panels, things like that, for another 100 years, then we might say, maybe we should take advantage of that underpricing of products that China's doing. But what we're seeing right now, and what we're discussing in the report as well, is that will not be the medium-term, let alone long-term average Chinese price of these products. Industrial policy at that scale of use cannot work. It will bankrupt the Chinese economy. And indeed, so much of the Chinese strength, such as it is, of the past decade, I would say, right, is due to off-balance sheet hidden debt building up in the system for local governments in the property sector and elsewhere too. And that tells us that as attractive as a cheap EV looks right now, landing in Amsterdam, that's not going to be around for that long. Once everyone else's suppliers are out of businesses, prices are going to go up dramatically, radically. And so as we think about the role of industrial policy in our system here, I do think we need to understand and sort of self-quarantine against letting our market structure be defined by the imprudent choices being made in policymaking in China today. So strongly agree with Brad on that.
So Clete, let me turn to you because we're thinking about how the US addresses this. I asked you about phase one and what the future might look like. But what about the WTO? I mean, you have extensive background negotiating with the WTO. It doesn't have to just be a bilateral conversation when it comes to addressing China's practices.
Yeah, that's right. But first, we've got this J.D. Vance Walls dynamic going on here. So
which one's which?
I didn't want to interrupt before.
I'm definitely Walls.
But I got to respond to the phase one comment because I think it's important, right? I think it's important. And the phase one deal has an enforcement mechanism. Under this enforcement mechanism, if you believe the other side is not complying with the deal, you start a process of consultations, and if that does not resolve the issue to your satisfaction, you can put in place tariffs. The Biden administration has not utilized the phase one deal enforcement mechanism. They didn't do anything on China tariffs for about 3.5 years until they endorsed the Trump framework and then made some tweaks around the margins. So I think to suggest that they tried and now we know that China will not comply if it is enforced, I think that's inaccurate because it hasn't happened. So I just wanted to make that point because I do think it's important, and that's where you will see a key distinction between the way that a Trump administration will handle phase one. Now going to the WTO, I think you were generally interested in my views of how we address the China challenge there. I will say I am a longtime proponent of trying to work with allies through the international system where we can. I am also a major pessimist on our ability to utilize that existing framework to deal with the problems that we're facing today with China. I think just given that China doesn't have an interest in changing, unless there is real pressure applied, and that the WTO requires consensus to effectively apply that pressure, I think it's really hard to see that as a viable path forward. What I would like to see is a configuration of the willing nations. I mean, some cross-section of G7, maybe you've got the Australians and the Koreans and others getting together and actually saying, you know what, we're going to try to create a set of norms and rules that go beyond WTO standards as it pertains to market economy activity that has more ambition, and try to adopt that paradigm and that hope that over time others can migrate into that system and then use that to pressure China. I just think the WTO as it stands today, we're not going to bring a dispute on China and change their behavior. We're not going to go to the WTO and get some new outcome that's going to change their behavior, because I think the prospect of getting consensus on that stuff is slim.
So in the spirit of the debate metaphor you raised, we agreed not to fact check, but I will just say here that,
the moderators are always
I didn't
stacked.
sign that agreement.
But,
the moderators are always stacked against the Republicans.
Yeah,
I'm just kidding.
No, bipartisan conversation. But I mean, Melanie, let me turn this to you. From my perspective, continuing the Trump tariffs over the time that the Biden administration was assessing what to do next is a policy choice in and of itself. It's not doing nothing from my perspective.
That's an okay fact check.
Is that a fair fact check?
So look, I think, what I'm hearing a little bit from Clete here has echoes of what I hear, and first of all, I think 90% we're in agreement. It's more of the tactics. Yeah. So what I'm hearing a little bit has echoes of what I hear from Russia, from my friends across the aisle, which is, but when we're in office, they'll respect us and do what we ask. And I think we just need to be, I really want to go back to Michelle's point earlier about look at what Xi Jinping thinks he needs to do to stay in office. And I am quite sure that Xi Jinping would be willing to throw some cash at us and buy a couple of loads of soybeans or other U.S. consumer goods to get us to back off of the things that really matter. But we have to be laser focused on the market fundamentals that are on that screen that show the many ways in which Beijing is seeking to use industrial policy to disadvantage the United States so that Chinese companies can make a buck at our expense. That's more than a couple loads of soybeans. That is getting really serious on pushing China to either reform economically, which we have to recognize is not going to happen, or adjust ourselves to account for the fact that we're not going to be getting a great deal out of Beijing. I think you see the Biden administration recognizing we are not going to be getting a great deal out of Beijing. Our best options are level the playing field for the goods that matter, which is why you see 100% tariffs on EVs, really focusing on those critical sectors, and then use smart industrial policy to invest in ourselves and work with allies and partners so that we can do those first two things in a way that benefits everyone and minimizes costs. What I fear is the idea that, but if it's me, like maybe Xi Jinping would be willing to do things that he hasn't been willing to do in his entire time as a leader. I think we should be very skeptical of what kind of offer is on the table with Beijing.
So we have about 10 minutes left. I have a flood of questions coming in online. You can use askac.org for those who haven't, although it feels like almost every viewer has already. So I'm going to try to bucket a few together. Michelle, let me turn to you on the yuan and internationalization. I mean, the question here, and there's a couple on, currency and the dollar and yuan, but I think to tie the threads together that I see is there any hope for Chinese policymakers to continue internationalization of the yuan, which is a stated policy objective, given some of the constraints we see in the data here?
Well, as long as you have capital controls as intense as they do, no. Yeah. I mean, you need the free flow of capital across borders, right? And so the one thing I would say, when you talk about convergence in some cases, Dan, with your report, is what I hear a strain of in the United States is the dollar is too strong. Therefore, we should tax foreign investment to reduce the desire for capital because we're growing so much more than everyone else. We've doubled the size compared to the size of the EU since 2008, right? So those moves that China's doing, I hear whispers that could happen here in the United States, versions of trying to slow down the movement of capital across the borders of the United States.
Yeah, that makes sense.
In a future administration.
Dan, let me turn to you on the data question we have here. What constraints have you felt as a researcher, given what was raised earlier in terms of lack of transparency of Chinese data? I don't think it's affected this project particularly. You can tell me if you agree or not, but I know it has on some of our work in collaboration.
It actually has been extremely painful over the years. I've spared you from some of it. This year, not least, and there is some discussion of it in the report. The team, we've got like 6 dozen different sets of data we need in order to provide this, high-level synthesis, this complexity, right? And it's really not too much to ask of a $17 trillion economy that it has basic data series available with which to, audit and grapple with how things are going, right? It's in everyone's self-interest to know how China's doing because it affects us all, as Michelle was noting, especially for a lot of emerging nations. If China sneezes, they're going to catch terrible pneumonia. And they've benefited immensely from commodity sales opportunities, both the quantity of stuff they dig out of the ground and the price for it. And now they're really staring right into an abyss of potential Chinese downside risk due to the macroeconomic problems. The way you manage those risks is by understanding the data and looking at the growth potential of the world's second largest economy. The IMF should be playing a policeman role to look at what China reports its GDP growth to be and kicking the tires on that. Instead, generally, they've simply been taking what numbers they're given and passing them on along and saying, okay, they look okay to us. Based on our grappling with the numbers, we're much less confident that official data streams do the job of enabling independent researchers to offer an objective picture such as we've been trying to do. There's a lot of heroic inferences that we're needing to make to finish the report year after year. We're talking about what to do in the next generation of this work, and job one is to think about what data is available, less and less official data, more and more sorts of alternative data, including satellite imagery data that tells you a lot about what's happening on the ground that no government, not America's, not China's, has an ability to totally black out that picture, right? So we're having to find workarounds because the quality and commitment in Beijing to making sure that adequate, basic national accounting data is available. It's a huge issue.
Just to highlight that point, where do you at Rhodium Group see Chinese GDP growth this year?
Well, there's a long version of that. I'll give you the short version. If you look at the most well-respected Chinese economists talking about how much emergency stimulus China needs right now in order to make its official target of 5.2% year-on-year growth, some of those estimates are up above 6 trillion renminbi. If that indeed is how much additional shoring up the Chinese economy needs, that means they're growing 0% this year. Now, the stimulus numbers we're actually going to get, I think, are going to be more in the lines maybe a third to half of that, which if you want to use that same methodology and back it out, means maybe they're growing 2, 2.5%, 3, 3.5% right now, depending on how you want to do the numbers. Nobody's going to settle this question, but that's my gut feeling. The IMF is not giving us a forecast of what they think China's growth is going to be. They're giving us a forecast of what they think China is going to say its growth was.
Well, that's a question we'll be asking IMF officials in 2 weeks when they join us for IMF World Bank Week. A nice teaser for that. We only have a few minutes left, but I want to get kind of final reflections from everyone. And Melanie, I'm going to start with you. Have the election in a few weeks, new administration, one way or the other. What does that look like from a policy perspective in terms of what can be different than what came before, both with Trump and with Biden? What should be done in an ideal circumstance going forward to wrangle all these challenges, to engage China, to compete with China, and to de-risk, which I know you're leading on here at the Council?
Sure. I mean, so in the economic space, I think our main focus should be what can we do at home and with allies and partners? Because Xi Jinping is going to Xi Jinping. And I'm very skeptical that we have the leverage to change that path, because I suspect that Xi Jinping feels that if he took his economy in the direction towards the West, that the Chinese Communist Party would lose its levers of control to a degree that they're not okay with. So given that, our best tools for shaping our own fortunes are really what we do investing at home and what we do with allies and partners. And the ally and partner piece is where we have some massive opportunity. I would love to see, I'm going to ask Clete after what he meant by the trade levers, because I think, really, if you really want to change the game, do a multilateral trade deal that China's not in. And you create a buyer's club where we're buying and selling with allies and partners based on our own rules, and Beijing is stuck on the outside, and unless until they clean up their act so that they can come in. That would be the biggest fix that I could see, and that's what I would love to see in a next administration.
Well, that's a good one to take forward for sure, both us at the Council and then working on that multilateral trade deal without China. Clete.
Yeah, no, I want to respond to that. I mean, because I agree, right? And I think, we talk about the engagement with China, and there's different narratives and different ways to do it, right? I think, again, when you're talking about changing their entire economic structure, no one in the Trump orbit would be naive enough to think that that's actually going to happen. It is more to recognize that we can engage with them in some meaningful ways while we really look at strategic de-risking, decoupling, whatever you want to call it over here. Now, on this trade deal point, I do want to elaborate on this because I think that there is a real opportunity here in a subsequent administration, and I would hope either. But what I would like us to focus on is the concept of a sectoral deal to de-risk from China in all the areas where we feel like we're over-reliant. And whether it be critical minerals, semiconductors, medical supply chains, things like that. And the way I would structure this would be you have sort of the alignment piece, and then you have the defensive piece, the offense and the defense. And the offense would be actually cutting tariffs between us, aligning standards between us, having access to each other's procurement programs, having access to each other's subsidies. And then the cost for being in that club, common external tariffs on China, common export controls, common investment restrictions. And I think those kinds of deals, real meaty sectoral deals, would really start this process of de-risking that is so important. And I think, I think that is an opportunity that we've kind of left on the shelf for a while here. And maybe we're not going to go back to comprehensive FTAs in the near term. But this is something that we can clearly do with our partners and allies that would make a difference.
That's great. We call it here at the Geoeconomic Center positive economic statecraft. There's the coercive side, and then there's the positive side. And really the reason why so many countries want to be part of a US-led system in the first place and rebalancing a little bit. Michelle.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I hope the US population is willing to go along with that, because remember, we had a deal with TPP, excuse me. And yes, it was killed by President Trump. However, it was going to die no matter who won that election, because when he killed that deal, every Democratic legislator breathed a sigh of relief that they didn't have to vote on it, because nobody wanted to support that deal at that moment, because trade deals were considered bad at the moment, and the US population was not in favor of them. Maybe things will change now. Maybe you'll have a better messenger to say this isn't about destroying jobs at home, which was the way it was perceived, but this is about shoring up our national security. So maybe that will be different.
Can I reply to that? Because
Yeah.
I think there's two really important distinctions here between what I'm talking about and what was TPP. Distinction number one is you're not doing comprehensive all sectors of the U.S. economy. So when you
That would
look
be
at
helpful.
TPP, all of the sectors, you have folks in the auto sector who are worried about it. You have folks in these other sectors who are worried about it. Here, we pick the sectors where we need to diversify, and everyone agrees on it for both economic and national security reasons. Second big distinction here is one of the critiques of TPP that I think was legitimate was that the rules of origin weren't strong enough so you could have backdoor Chinese content coming into the United States through these other countries. This deal would explicitly include provisions to have common external tariffs on China. It would include provisions to coordinate on export controls and investment restrictions with China. So you would really be addressing, I think, two of the things that led to TPP's demise, and it would be a way to start building back a trade agenda that meets the moment.
And is supported by the US public.
Yeah, I think so.
Dan, I want to turn to you, and in the closing minutes, what you think should happen going forward, but also just a reflection. We're at 4 years of doing this, the Pathfinder project, the end of this generation of Pathfinder. I'm just curious, from when we started in 21 to now, what surprised you the most about the research, what you didn't expect?
I think, well, first of all, Josh, let me say it's been such an honor and a privilege to do this in partnership with the Geoeconomics Center. Rhodium is an amazing assemblage of like 35 heavy-hitting China researchers, but we don't have a lot of the assets you guys have here to help put the story together in a way that's going to most effectively land on the policymaker desk and give it additional impact. So thank you so much for the partnership so far.
Likewise.
As we think about what's worth doing next on this whole front, it's really important to look back the past 4 years, think about what was most surprising. I think not just me, but probably just about everyone, including most Chinese economists in China, including those working at Chinese government agencies, are probably surprised and discomforted by how completely the leadership has prioritized political considerations and ideology and political messaging over all aspects of economic efficiency. The peril that the Chinese economy faces today, the damage to its long-term potential growth narrative that they can credibly talk to their friends around the world in trying to claw away a little bit of bandwidth from the United States, that has been greatly diminished. And it's not just a short-term thing that can be fixed by them flipping a few switches. It's going to take them a very long time and be extremely painful for them to do this. Yes, I mean, we get it. They want to make sure that they maintain their hold on power. And offices are like democratic niceties. Power is the whole shebang, right? But here's the thing. Without a certain baseline of economic dynamism, they don't get to stay in power. or they stay in power on top of something that is shrinking in size, constantly facing social stability risks. These are the hard economic realities that Xi Jinping has to deal with. And it's shocking how starkly that has been put on the table by the policy choices of the past 4 years. Even just the announcement of new stimulus moves of the past two weeks, right, are like the end of zero COVID as well, which we all remember, are a stark capitulation that everything said previously, read my lips, we're not going to do this kind of stimulus that you're looking for because Chinese people can tolerate more bitterness and hang in there, is not the case. And they're having to toss that overboard and look at how are we going to get this thing back on track, because if we don't, we're not going to have a system here to stay in charge of. And I think it's just really, really shocking to how clear that is from as we've unpacked it in the project, right, the past 4 years. Whatever happens the next 4 years, it has to be quite different from what we've seen the previous 4. Might not go the way we want it on both sides of the house to go, but it's not going to go the way that Xi Jinping wanted it to go either.
Yeah. I'll let that be the final word, and we have been so pleased to collaborate on this and look forward to the next generation and seeing what happens over the next 4 years and beyond together. Melanie, Clete, Michelle, thank you for being with us today. I want to thank the fantastic team of researchers behind the scenes that helped put this together. On the Atlantic Council side, Ben Lenine, Sophia Bush, Jeremy Mark. On the Rhodium side, Matt Mingy, Laura Gromley, Austin Jordan, and many who have contributed to this work over the past 4 years, including Niels Graham, Rachel Lietzow, Nargiza Salajanova, and Thilo Hahnemann. We have more coming from the Atlantic Council in the weeks ahead. IMF World Bank Week kicks off in less than 2 weeks, where we will discuss some of the issues raised today. And on November 13th, we launched the next project in collaboration with Rhodium Group on China and Taiwan economic crisis and what it means for the rest of the world, with a particular focus on G20 economies in this study. So stay with us at the Atlantic Council. We wish everyone a pleasant rest of the day.